Stanley didn't hate his wife, but he was ashamed of her. That shame led him to take his lover, Stella, to a critical business meeting, introducing her as his wife. Stanley thought he had everything under control. Yet, what was about to unfold at that meeting would leave him utterly shaken. Stanley had built a life of prestige and power. From his luxurious office, he projected the image of a successful entrepreneur. His commanding presence and smooth navigation through business deals made him the centerpiece of every negotiation. To the outside world, he appeared to be a man who had it all. But beneath this polished facade lay a different reality. Stanley harbored deep disdain for his wife, Anne. They had been married for over 15 years. In the early days, Anne had been his rock, believing in his dreams, managing their modest home, and standing by him through every trial. Together, they had laughed, shared dreams, and tackled life's challenges as a team. As Stanley climbed the corporate ladder, his perception of Anne began to change. To him, her quiet, simple demeanor was no longer an asset. Instead, she felt like an anchor holding him back from the image he now craved, glamorous, dazzling, and ostentatious, and didn't fit into the high-profile world he had worked so hard to enter. Stella came into Stanley's life when his frustration with and was at its peak. Stella was everything and wasn't. Vibrant, stylish, and exuding an air of confidence that turned heads. Stella loved luxury and attention, and Stanley saw her as the perfect companion to complement his growing success. She became his secret weapon at social gatherings, charming potential clients and making Stanley feel like he had truly arrived. Their affair flourished, with Stella becoming a constant presence in Stanley's world of business and pleasure. He paraded her at corporate events, presenting her as his wife to impress associates. Stella thrived in the role, and Stanley believed he had mastered the delicate balance of his double life. What he failed to realize, however, was that Anne was far more observant than he gave her credit for. She noticed his frequent absences, the unexplained business trips, and the subtle changes in his demeanor. Though she didn't confront him, she quietly began to piece things together. Stanley, meanwhile, remained oblivious to Anne's suspicions. His focus was fixed on an upcoming opportunity, a meeting with foreign investors that promised to take his company to unprecedented heights. Millions of dollars were on the line, and failure was not an option. As the meeting approached, Stanley decided Stella would be the perfect partner to accompany him. Her charm and elegance would ensure the investors were impressed. Confident in his plan, he felt certain that he had everything under control. But life has a way of dismantling even the most carefully crafted facades. The events that unfolded during that fateful meeting would unravel Stanley's web of deceit, leaving him to face consequences he had never imagined. However, Stanley knew that sealing this deal required more than financial skill. The investors needed to be impressed, charmed by the right image. For a brief moment, he considered taking Anne to the meeting, but dismissed the thought almost immediately. Anne, he muttered to himself with a grimace, imagining her quiet, modest demeanor clashing with the high-profile businessmen. She lacked the sparkle, the charisma, the allure he believed essential to captivate these investors. Stella, on the other hand, was a perfect fit. Stanley envisioned her radiating confidence, effortlessly charming the investors with her beauty and poise. Satisfied with his choice, Stanley made up his mind. Stella would accompany him to the meeting. Her presence would be the final touch to secure the deal. She was the missing piece to his success, the glamour that would dazzle the investors and elevate his position in their eyes. With Stella by his side, Stanley was convinced the contract was as good as signed. Yet, Stanley knew he had to keep his plan from Anne. Despite her outward trust, he couldn't risk even the smallest mistake. The plan needed precision. That evening, as Stanley sat down for dinner with Anne, he steeled himself for the first step of his deception. She brought the meal to the table with her usual calm, gentle smile, and he casually initiated the conversation. "Love," Stanley said, slicing into his steak as if the topic were nothing extraordinary. "Remember that important meeting I told you about? It's been scheduled. I'll need to travel later this week, just for a day or two." It's crucial for closing a major contract, and looked at him with her usual serene, trusting eyes. Of course, dear. I know how much this means to you. Let me know if you need help packing, she offered warmly. Stanley forced a composed smile, pleased with how smoothly things were unfolding. Thank you, love, but that won't be necessary, he replied lightly. He felt a surge of confidence and trusted him completely. She never suspected his true intentions. It's going to be a quick, intense trip, Stanley continued. I prefer to travel light without too much baggage. Besides, this is the deal I've been working toward, $1 million contract. The investors are thrilled, and I'm confident this will open enormous doors for the company. And nodded, her calm demeanor unchanged. I know you'll do great, she said softly. But as Stanley reveled in his apparent mastery of the situation, he remained oblivious to the quiet resolve behind Anne's eyes. She had noticed the subtle changes in him. The frequent business trips, the unexplained absences, and the way his affection had become more surface level over time. The moment of reckoning was approaching, and Stanley had no idea that the biggest shock of this trip wouldn't come from the investors. Anne, quietly observing, was far more aware of her husband's betrayal than he could ever imagine, and admired Stanley's dedication to his work, completely unaware that he was meticulously planning the trip to be with Stella. In Stanley's mind, everything was falling into place perfectly. He had planned every detail, ensuring Stella was available for the trip. The next day, Stanley called Stella, his tone smooth and confident. Stella, he began, the meeting with the foreign investors is scheduled. I need you by my side. This is a big event, and your presence will make all the difference. We'll impress them, and with you there, I'm sure everything will go perfectly. On the other end, Stella smiled, fully ready to step into the role Stanley had carved out for her. She thrived on the idea of being part of his success. Stanley hung up, satisfied. He could already picture the scene. Him and Stella entering the grand meeting room, the investors dazzled by her charm, and the moment he secured the lucrative contract. Meanwhile, Anne would remain at home, none the wiser, trusting in her husband's image as a hard-working provider. Stanley believed he had crafted the perfect plan, success in business and the ideal partner by his side. What he failed to see was that no matter how flawless his strategy seemed, something unexpected was lurking, ready to unravel everything. The day of the trip arrived, and Stanley brimmed with confidence. He wore his best-tailored suit and had a bright smile on his face as he arrived at the airport with Stella. She turned heads with every step, dressed in an elegant outfit that accentuated her figure and radiated sophistication. Stanley felt a swell of pride. She was exactly the image he needed to project. When they landed in Buenos Aires, they went straight to the luxurious hotel where the meeting would take place. The conference room was impressive. A polished wooden table dominated the center, surrounded by sleek black leather chairs. The walls were decorated with modern art, and floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the city skyline. The air was thick with anticipation as Stanley and Stella prepared to meet the investors. Everything had been arranged to perfection, or so Stanley thought. But as he moved confidently toward what he believed would be a career-defining moment, the cracks in his carefully constructed facade were about to show. This contract had the potential to change the future of his company, and Stanley was determined to shine. He walked into the room with an air of superiority, striding past the receptionist without a glance. His focus was singular as he made his way to the polished table where 3 investors awaited him. The investors represented a mix of personalities: a middle-aged man with a stern expression and commanding presence, a rather ordinary-looking woman whose quiet confidence filled the room, and a relaxed but attentive man who watched every move. Stanley smiled confidently, addressing them as he reached the head of the table. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to finally meet you all. I'm thrilled to discuss the future of our partnership. He sat at the head of the table, and Stella gracefully took her seat beside him. He felt their eyes flicker towards Stella, her elegance and charm holding their attention. Stanley, fueled by their interest, introduced her with pride. Before we begin, Stanley said, his tone measured and self-assured, I'd like to introduce you to my wife, Stella. She is an integral part of who I am and what we are building together. Stella offered a warm, polite smile, her posture poised. But Stanley noticed a female investor raise a single eyebrow, her gaze sharp as though sizing up the situation. He chose to interpret it as a positive response. Bonjour, the woman said, her voice calm but precise, laced with a French accent. It's a pleasure to meet you, Stella. Her dark sunglasses framed a face partly veiled by thick black bangs. There was an elegance about her that made her hard to read. I'm sure you have valuable insights to share. Stanley missed a subtle challenge in her words. He leaned forward, eager to maintain the momentum. Exactly, he replied. Stella has a unique vision of the market, and her contribution will be crucial to our success. The female investor nodded lightly, her faint smile betraying nothing more. Stanley launched into his proposal with renewed energy, presenting charts and figures with conviction. Stella, in her role, nodded at strategic moments, her gaze attentive, giving the impression she was deeply involved. Our company, Stanley declared with a sweeping gesture, is on the verge of a major breakthrough. This contract is not just an opportunity for profits, but a leap into an innovative future. With your investment, we can expand our horizons and achieve remarkable growth. The male investors appeared receptive, nodding as Stanley spoke, but the female investor's demeanor remained reserved. Her attention seemed split, not solely focused on the financials, but instead flitting between the presentation and the dynamic between Stanley and Stella. There was something about her presence that unsettled Stanley. Her gaze carried a weight, a quiet intensity that felt personal, almost invasive. She seemed familiar in a way that made him uneasy, though he couldn't place it. Shaking the thought from his mind, he refocused. In your last report, the woman said suddenly, her tone sharpening, you mentioned the need for structural changes. Could you elaborate on how you plan to implement them? Stanley smiled, determined to maintain control. Of course, he said smoothly. We're prepared to integrate new technologies that will boost efficiency by 30%. This will not only lead to higher profits, but also allow us to provide better service to our clients. As he spoke, the atmosphere in the room began to shift. The male investors nodded thoughtfully, but the female investors' gaze grew sharper, cutting through Stanley's practiced confidence. It felt as though she wasn't just assessing the proposal. She was assessing him and Stella, reading between the lines of what wasn't being said. Despite his polished demeanor, Stanley couldn't shake the feeling that the female investor was onto something he couldn't control. Her presence carried an air of mystery, and her measured responses hinted at deeper layers Stanley wasn't prepared for. Stanley could feel his confidence beginning to waver under her piercing scrutiny. He pressed on, forcing himself to ignore the growing knot of discomfort in his chest. And how do you plan to handle governance issues that may arise with the implementation of these innovations? She asked, her tone now sharp and challenging. It's crucial to ensure all stakeholders are engaged. Stanley hesitated for a fraction of a second, caught off guard. He quickly masked his uncertainty with a practiced smile. Absolutely, he replied smoothly. We are committed to maintaining an open dialogue with all our partners. Transparency is key, and we're ready to address any concerns one by one. But as he spoke, a small alarm began to ring in his mind. The conversation was turning more intricate than he had anticipated, and Stella's presence, which was supposed to be his greatest support, wasn't having the effect he had imagined. For the first time, Stanley began to question whether bringing her had been the right choice. The female investor remained silent, her sharp gaze fixed unwaveringly on Stanley. The tension in the room thickened. Stanley found himself grappling with an unsettling realization. Charm and appearances alone wouldn't be enough to sway this woman. He had underestimated his audience and overestimated his own influence. Stanley was in the midst of delivering his closing remarks when the female investor finally leaned forward. Her polite posture shifted into something far more intense. Slowly, she removed her sunglasses, revealing piercing dark eyes that seemed to see straight through him. When she spoke, her voice was cool, steady, and unforgiving. "Monsieur Stanley," she began, switching effortlessly to polished French, "charm alone will not secure this partnership. You must demonstrate true commitment and a deep understanding of what you're proposing. Otherwise, I'm afraid our expectations will not be met." Stanley felt his composure slip for the first time. A bead of sweat formed at his temple, and he struggled to maintain his confident smile. "Of course, madam," he said, nodding quickly. "I understand perfectly." But inside, he felt anything but confident. He realized, with a sinking heart, that this woman wasn't someone who could be easily impressed or distracted. The carefully crafted illusion of control he had brought into the meeting was beginning to crack under the weight of her scrutiny. The confidence that had carried him this far faltered as he grasped for a way to regain his footing. Stella, seated beside him, glanced his way, her usual poised demeanor slightly shaken as well. She offered a supportive smile, but it did little to ease the growing tension in the room, or in Stanley's mind. The investor, her voice firm and her gaze piercing, continued without missing a beat. "Stanley, can you explain how your company plans to maintain control over the infrastructure during this expansion? I've noticed some recent changes in management. How are you addressing those?" Stanley hesitated, caught off guard by the depth of the question. This wasn't something he had prepared for. Questions about internal management hadn't even crossed his mind. He scrambled for an answer, forcing himself to maintain his confident facade. "Ah, yes," he said, his voice slightly uneven. "We're making adjustments to the team to ensure efficient management. We have trained professionals ready to handle any changes that come up." The woman's lips curved into a faint smile, as though she had been expecting such a vague reply. She leaned forward, her sharp gaze never leaving his, and the air in the room shifted. "And what about your new chief financial officer?" she pressed, her voice cool and deliberate. "I've heard he's made some significant changes to operations. Are you familiar with the new resource allocation policy he's implemented?" Stanley blinked, his confidence wavering further. How did she know about the recent hire? The new CFO had barely settled in, and Stanley hadn't been involved in the operational changes yet. They were being handled by his subordinates. His unease grew as he stammered out a response. Yes, of course," he said hastily. "We're aligning our strategies, and everything is under control." Beside him, Stella cast him a worried glance, sensing something was wrong. Stanley's practiced smile faltered, and a chill ran down his spine. This woman wasn't an ordinary investor. She knew too much. But how? Then, with deliberate precision, the investor leaned forward, her gaze locked on Stanley. A provocative smile spread across her face as her hands moved up to her hair. Slowly, she began to remove her wig. The sleek false hair slid off, revealing dark wavy locks beneath. Stanley's breath caught as the woman slipped off her sunglasses, wiped away the heavy makeup concealing her features, and looked him directly in the eye. It was Anne, his wife. Stanley's world tilted as the realization hit him like a freight train. The woman he had tried so hard to deceive, the one he thought he could hide his double life from, was sitting right in front of him. "Surprise, Stanley," and said, her tone calm but cutting. Stanley stood frozen, his heart pounding like a drum. He blinked repeatedly, as if trying to dispel an illusion. "And what? What are you doing here?" "How?" he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Anne, now free of her disguise, kept her gaze steady, her expression cool and controlled. "I am one of the main investors in your company, Stanley," she said, her voice measured and deliberate. "While you were busy deceiving me and parading around with your mistress, I was quietly building my own empire. I knew everything, every move, every meeting. And now," she paused, letting her words sink in, "I control a significant part of your business." Stella, sitting next to Stanley, was paralyzed with shock, her eyes wide as she tried to process the scene unfolding before her. Stanley felt the color drain from his face. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His mind raced, grasping for an explanation and escape. Anything, but there was nothing. And leaned back, her calm demeanor unshaken, and added, "You underestimated me, Stanley. That was your first mistake." The revelation hit Stanley like an avalanche, crushing the confidence he had built his entire life upon. Everything he thought he had under control was crumbling, slipping through his grasp like sand. In a voice barely above a whisper, still clinging to disbelief, Stanley muttered, "No, this can't be true. You, how?" Anne's smile was cool, unbothered, and filled with a quiet triumph. "Yes, Stanley," she replied, her voice steady and sharp. "Me. While you underestimated me, I was quietly accumulating shares and influence in the company. I made smart investments, watched and waited, and now here I am. The woman you thought wasn't good enough for your business is controlling more than you ever imagined." The two other investors exchanged looks, their expressions a mix of mild disdain and knowing surprise. The truth had unraveled before them, and everything about Stanley's false confidence now made sense. Stanley's hands trembled slightly as he tried to compose himself. He stared at Anne, his mind racing for an explanation and escape anything. "But why, Anne?" he asked, his voice tinged with desperation. "Why would you do this? We're married." Anne's expression remained calm, her words slicing through his plea with icy precision. "Married?" she echoed, her tone almost mocking. "It seems you forgot that more times than I can count. And as for running the company, maybe you should have paid more attention to what was happening under your own nose. While you were busy keeping up appearances and betraying me, I was busy planning my future." The room was heavy with silence. Stanley's mind spun, his confidence shattered. He glanced at Stella, hoping for some semblance of support, but she was frozen in place, wide-eyed and speechless. His throat tightened, and he felt the weight of every gaze in the room on him. His face was tense, his palms clammy. He had lost control of the situation completely. Desperation seeped into his voice as he pleaded, "And please, we can fix this. I can make things right. It doesn't have to end like this." Anne didn't flinch. Her voice was cold, relentless. "Fix what, Stanley? You betrayed me, disrespected me, and thought I was nothing more than a piece of furniture in your life. Now it's too late for regrets. I'm in control, and you'll have to face the consequences of your actions." Stanley sank into his chair, the weight of his crumbling world bearing down on him. His business, his image, his carefully crafted double life. It was all gone, ripped apart before his eyes. And the person who had brought it all down was the one he had underestimated the most. And stood tall, the investor silent, but clearly aligned with her presence and authority. Even Stella, who had always exuded confidence and charm, seemed to shrink in the moment, unsure of her place in the unfolding disaster. Stanley sat there, defeated, as Anne turned to address the room, her voice clear and commanding. "Shall we move on to discuss the future of this company? One that no longer has room for deceit." The meeting continued, but for Stanley, it was over. Stanley sat frozen, his usually confident demeanor shattered as Anne's calm, yet piercing words filled the room. His arrogance had blinded him. He had always believed he controlled everything and everyone, but the truth now stood before him. It was, and who had been in control all along. He had underestimated her, assuming she was oblivious to his actions. Yet, and had quietly observed, piecing together the fragments of his betrayal. While suspicion simmered, she chose patience over confrontation, waiting for the perfect moment to act. And unlike him, she had played the game flawlessly. The silence in the room stretched endlessly, the weight of tension pressing on everyone. Finally, Anne decided to break it. Her voice was serene yet firm, each word landing like a hammer. "You know, Stanley," she began, her gaze unwavering. It wasn't difficult to uncover your betrayals. In fact, you were never very good at hiding them. From the first suspicious glance, the first flimsy excuse, I knew. But I didn't confront you then. Instead, I waited. I let time work in my favor. Stanley's breath quickened, erratic and shallow. His composure was slipping fast, and his eyes darted around the room, seeking an ally. The two investors remained stoic, their faces unreadable. Stella, his once reliable partner in deception, sat pale and stunned, avoiding Anne's unyielding gaze. "I can explain," Stanley stammered, his voice cracking under the pressure. "It's not," and cut him off with a sharp look. "Explain what, Stanley? That you betrayed me with Stella? That you saw me as an obstacle? That you despised and underestimated me? I don't need your explanations. I already know." She took a deliberate step closer to him, crossing her arms as she continued, her tone cold and measured. "The question isn't about what you did anymore. It's about what I did while you thought you were in control." Stanley's heart raced, his chest tightening as if an invisible weight was pressing him into his chair. "While you were distracted, Stanley," and said, her voice growing sharper, "I was building something of my own. I observed, I learned, I studied, and slowly, I began acquiring shares in your company. I invested. I made decisions you couldn't even fathom. And now," she gestured to the stunned faces around them, "as you can see, I am one of the primary investors." Her words cut deeper than Stanley had ever thought possible. His confidence, his image of himself as the genius behind the company's success, was disintegrating, and leaned in slightly, her expression icy yet composed. "Every step you've taken these past few years has been watched, Stanley. I saw you stumble, but I didn't worry. I knew that at the right moment, everything would align." She straightened, her tone final. "And that moment is now." Sweat dripped down Stanley's brow, his mind racing as he tried to comprehend the enormity of her revelation. He had built his empire, believing himself untouchable. But now he realized it had all been under Anne's quiet and strategic watch. Stella sat in stunned silence, her once poised confidence shattered. The investors exchanged glances, clearly impressed by Anne's control and foresight. Stanley slumped back into his chair, utterly defeated. What he had thought was his victory had been a carefully orchestrated plan by Anne, a plan that had brought him to his knees. Stanley's voice trembled as he tried to push back. "But the company, and if you do this, you will ruin everything. I'm the CEO. You can't." Anne's icy voice cut through his protest like a blade. "Ruin the company? I'm not you, Stanley. I've worked tirelessly to ensure its success. While you were busy parading your lies and keeping up appearances, I was the one truly in control. You were just a face, a facade. If anyone is capable of taking care of this company, it's me." She paused deliberately, letting her words sink in. Stanley's face paled as he began to realize the depth of his vulnerability. Not only was his image being dismantled, but the very foundation of his business was crumbling beneath him. Anne's slight smile didn't soften the blow as she continued, "And this meeting? I organized it all. I wanted to give you a chance to show everyone who you really are. I thought it would be fascinating to see you bring your lover to a meeting I arranged, trying to sell your perfect image." She leaned forward slightly, her tone sharp with satisfaction. "And guess what? You didn't disappoint. Now, everyone here knows exactly who you are." Stanley's gaze darted around the room, seeking even the faintest sign of support, but he found none. The investors beside and kept their faces neutral, but their silence was damning. He could feel the judgment emanating from their restrained expressions. Desperation clawed at him and he stammered, "And I didn't know. I never thought." Anne's glare was cutting as she interrupted. "Exactly. You never thought. You never imagined, because you never paid attention to me. You saw me as just a simple wife, incapable of understanding your world, a burden you carried." But while you were betraying me, Stanley, I was preparing myself. You underestimated the wrong person. The bitterness of defeat churned in Stanley's chest. For the first time in his life, he was facing the harsh truth that his carefully constructed world was falling apart. His control, his reputation, even his marriage, everything was slipping through his fingers like sand. The silence in the room was suffocating. Stanley sat motionless, his mind racing as he grappled with the enormity of what was happening. He was on the brink of losing not only his wife and his dignity, but possibly even the company that he had once believed was his alone to command. Stanley sat frozen, his once proud posture now slumped under the weight of Anne's words. She delivered her final blow with unwavering calm. I don't need you, Stanley. The company doesn't need you. I can handle everything on my own, and I will. You can continue parading around with your lovers, but know this. In business, you are no longer anyone. This was your last mistake. The room fell into a suffocating silence. Stanley turned his eyes to Stella, desperate for some kind of support, but she seemed as lost as he was. Her gaze avoided his, her expression a mixture of shock and regret. It was clear she hadn't anticipated being caught in something so monumental, something far bigger than her. Realizing there was nothing left to say, Stanley lowered his head in defeat. He had lost it all: respect, trust, and now, potentially, the very company he had once held as his crowning achievement. Anne rose gracefully, her composure intact, and addressed the investors. Now that we've clarified a few things, let's proceed with the partnership details. If you'll allow me, I have some proposals I'd like to present. The investors nodded, their expressions shifting to focus on, and as the clear authority in the room. The respect and confidence they showed her were undeniable. Meanwhile, Stanley remained silent, feeling the crushing realization that his personal and professional worlds had crumbled before his eyes. He was now nothing more than a powerless bystander, watching the inevitable unfold. Anne stood tall, her confidence unshaken, as she turned back to Stanley one last time. Her voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, sharp with finality. Regarding the company, she began, there are still decisions to be made. Decisions that will affect the future of this business and our personal relationship. You'll know soon enough. I won't resolve everything here and now. She paused, her piercing gaze locking onto his, a coolness in her expression underscored by a faint trace of irony. I'll give you some time to reflect on all of this. Stanley tried to respond, but his throat felt dry, and no words came. He knew any attempt to fix things in that moment would be futile, and held all the power. His fate and the company's future were firmly in her hands. Stella, sitting nearby, shifted uncomfortably. She understood now that she had no place in this scene. The weight of confusion and discomfort pressed down on her, and she glanced briefly at Stanley. But he didn't even notice her. He was too consumed by his own defeat. All she saw was a broken man, a shadow of the confident figure she had once admired. Without a word, Stella rose from her chair. Moving as quietly and discreetly as she could, she slipped out of the room, avoiding the gazes of the investors and Anne. She understood that her presence was now irrelevant, and within moments, she would be forgotten by everyone in the room. Anne, fully in command, turned back to the investors, a new chapter of leadership unfolding before her. And Stanley? He sat there, staring at the table, knowing he had lost everything and that there was no one to blame but himself, and watched as Stella quietly left the room, but she gave little attention to her departure. Stella, in the end, was just another insignificant piece in the grand scheme and had carefully crafted. Her focus was solely on Stanley, on the way he had underestimated her intelligence and patience all these years. The other investors began gathering their documents, fully aware that the purpose of the meeting had shifted entirely. They cast respectful glances at Anne, impressed by her stance and the control she now had over the situation. It was clear to them that from now on, any decision regarding the company partnership would be in her hands. Turning to the investors, and offered a slight smile, her voice confident. "Thank you for your patience. We'll be in touch soon to discuss the next steps." I believe we're all eager to see the company thrive under these new decisions. With that, the meeting was officially over. The door closing behind them marked the end of a chapter, one that should have been a triumph for Stanley, but instead, it had become his greatest defeat. Once everyone had left, and gave Stanley one last glance. He remained seated, his trembling hands resting on the table. He looked like he had aged years in just a matter of minutes, weighed down by the crushing revelation. Anne's final words came without emotion, but they were cutting final. "When I'm ready, you'll know my decision. Until then, take this time to reflect on your mistakes." And with that, she turned and walked out, leaving Stanley alone. The soft click of the door closing seemed to echo in his mind like the end of an era. The room, once filled with power and promises, now felt empty and cold. He was utterly and completely alone. Stanley sat in his now dimly lit apartment, staring blankly at the empty bottles on the table. The grandeur of the meeting room, the confidence he once had, were distant memories. In their place was the heavy silence of a life stripped down to its bare bones. He was no longer the man in control, no longer the one giving orders. The realization hit him with every passing second, with every breath that felt heavier than the last. He reached for his phone, hoping for a message or call. Anything to remind him that he wasn't truly alone in this new, grim reality. But the screen remained blank, just like his future. Anne's voice, steady and unyielding, kept replaying in his mind. "You'll know my decision soon." Those words haunted him, gnawing at his consciousness. He had once laughed at the thought of him being capable of action, of revenge. But she had taken his arrogance and used it as the very foundation of his downfall. Stanley had underestimated her, assuming that her silence meant submission. Now, all he could hear was the silence of his own downfall. He let out a hollow chuckle. Fate certainly had a twisted sense of irony. When the official notice arrived, Stanley skimmed the words, but their meaning didn't quite sink in at first. His heart pounded in his chest, and beads of sweat formed on his forehead. He read the notice again, slower this time, trying to grasp the reality, and had filed a lawsuit months ago. His hands shook, making it difficult to hold the paper steady. The words on the page were cold and unfeeling, spelling out his doom, division of assets, majority ownership, and control over the company. It all felt like a surreal nightmare, a bad dream he couldn't wake up from. The court's decision was swift, almost ruthless. Anne's quiet acquisitions over the years had paid off, giving her a significant stake in the company. Her contributions, once dismissed by Stanley as inconsequential, were now the key in the legal proceedings. The judge's gavel struck with finality, and with it, Stanley's illusion of power shattered. He was no longer the master of his fate, and held all the cards now, and she played them with precision. Stanley's world unraveled even further when, and fired Stella without ceremony. She sent a cold, impersonal email. Asterisk, your services are no longer required. Asterisk, Stella had been a fixture by Stanley's side, his confidant and lover, but now she was discarded like a used tool. It took her less than an hour to pack her things and leave the office, leaving Stanley to face the fallout alone. Stella didn't look back. She didn't call. She didn't even leave a note. She had aligned herself with power, and now that Stanley had lost his, she had no reason to stay. Days blurred into weeks, and Stanley felt the weight of every passing hour. His apartment, once filled with luxury and laughter, now felt cold and unfamiliar. He had lost everything that had defined him. His job, his wealth, his reputation. The silence in the apartment was only broken by the occasional ding of news alerts on his phone, each one announcing another victory for Anne's company. Every headline was a cruel reminder of his failure, each success a testament to Anne's strength. Anne, on the other hand, thrived. She restructured the company, implementing changes Stanley had never had the foresight to make. Her leadership brought in a multi-million-dollar contract, something Stanley had only dreamed of securing. As the company's profits soared, so did Anne's confidence. She was no longer the timid woman Stanley had once belittled. She was a woman who had outsmarted him, outplayed him, and taken everything he held dear. Stanley watched from afar, disconnected from the life he had once known. The bitterness in his heart grew with every new article, every mention of Anne's achievements. He had built the company with his ambition, but it was Anne's quiet determination that had turned it into an empire. An empire he could only see from the outside now, through news feeds and whispered conversations that stopped whenever he walked by. One day, as he walked aimlessly through the streets, Stanley passed by the company's towering headquarters. His eyes lingered on the building's name, which now bore Anne's name in bold letters. The sight felt like a knife twisting in his chest. He had built this legacy, yet he was nothing more than a forgotten chapter in its story. The weight of his mistakes pressed down on him, and for the first time, Stanley understood the depth of his downfall. He had been blinded by his pride and his need for control. Now, he was stripped of everything, left with nothing but the echoes of his past and the cold reality of a future shaped by the very woman he had underestimated. And that was Stanley's story, a costly lesson in arrogance and underestimating others. As we reflect on everything Stanley lost and everything it achieved, it's hard not to wonder if we sometimes fall into the same trap of pride and complacency. If this story made you think or open up a new perspective, leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe buttons so you won't miss our upcoming videos. Let's continue sharing stories and learning from life's mistakes together. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.